Welcome everybody to the High Return Real Estate Show. This is Shecky, and I am here with my amazing business partner, Mr. Jack Gibson. How you doing, Jack?
Doing great, Shecky. All right, ready to go.
Yeah, I am so excited for this one. We have got a really great show for you. No guests today. This is just going to be a raw, uncut conversation that is about an age-old argument in the buy and hold section of real estate investing. And really, we're going to uncover all the myths and all the truths about which is better, the BRRRR method or the turnkey method. There's no question there are merits and demerits to both, but we're going to reveal everything in this episode. So if you really want to get a great education, listen up. Welcome to the High Return Real Estate Show, the podcast for heavy hitters. 2 men, 1 mission. It's time to build your empire. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're here to have probably one of the most important chicken versus the egg conversations. Which is better, the BRRRR method or turnkey? And Jack, I know this is kind of a conversation that we've only had, 300 or 400 times with a few different investors. And it's just one of those things that is, there's not necessarily always a right answer here, but as you listen carefully, we're going to go through each point. You're going to have to figure out what's best for you. So we're going to do our level best to provide the information in a very factual way. And, we may be a little bit biased towards turnkey because we own a turnkey company. But that said, we do agree that there are some really great advantages to the BRRRR method in certain cases. So we're going to cover each one all the way through. So just to get started, I want to just cover what do things stand for. So if you're new to this term BRRRR, we're not talking about the freezing temperatures in the Midwest in the middle of winter. We are talking about BRRRR, which stands for buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. And it's a very common term in investing circles. So we're going to go through each one. And as we go through each component, we're going to talk about the 2 different ways to do that, whether you're going to do it on your own as a BRRRR or do it through using a turnkey. So let's start, first of all, Jack, on the buy, right? If any investor, not just you, but any investor, we're going to go out and buy a property to rehab it for the sake of buying and holding it and making cash flow on it. What are their options?
Well, are we now talking about out of state, or we're talking about somebody local? There's quite a bit of difference between those 2 scenarios, right?
I think let's just be clear that it makes sense to have this episode geared towards an out of state investor. In other words, doing a BRRRR in your own backyard, just to start this off, is going to be 10,000 times easier than doing a BRRRR from out of state. That said, There are many investors that are attempting to do BRRRRs long distance only because it doesn't make sense for them to do buy and holds in their own backyard, right? The numbers just don't support it. Prices are too expensive. Price to rent ratios just don't work out for them. Here in the Midwest, where we have lower prices and we have excellent price to rent ratios, it does make sense to do BRRRRs here, but it obviously is going to be a lot easier for somebody living here to do their own BRRRR. So let's frame this under the assumption that the people listening to this are considering, well, should I do a BRRRR or should I do a turnkey? I live in an expensive area like Seattle or LA or New York or New Jersey, and I'm thinking of doing this in the Midwest. So let's use that as our model. So that said, let me go back and re-ask the question and say, for an investor trying to do a long distance BRRRR from outside of the Midwest into the Midwest, what are their options on the buy?
Well, they can certainly go to the MLS, right? I mean, they can log on and try to look for things that are already listed by a realtor. So you can get a hold of a realtor that knows the area very well and start, like letting them present you with lots of different options that, that you can look at. You could certainly try to, although much more difficult from long distance, try to pick things up at like a tax sale. But those are, just thinking about that, right, Shecky? I mean, you got to have somebody present to put the bids in, right? So you better have somebody that you trust at that tax sale. So if you want to try to pick them up there, or you can get a hold of a wholesaler. There's wholesalers, not all markets have wholesalers, but most do that have, good, strong cash flow opportunities. So you could have a wholesaler kind of feed you a lot of options. So other than that, Shecky, I mean, those are the main ones that are kind of coming up for me. If you really want to get, more really hands-on, I mean, you can start mailing out postcards to, yourself to different zip codes looking for distressed buyers. But that in and of itself, wow, that would be quite the challenge, right? I mean, trying to do that from a long distance.
Yeah, well, then you're kind of acting as your own wholesaler as well, too. So
right.
The thing that I want to illuminate here is how, if a turnkey company is doing acquisition, like we're a turnkey company, maybe explain the difference. Like, tell the listeners, how are we going out and getting properties?
Well, we're doing all of those things. In addition, we have our acquisition team with 20 years of experience inside of the Indianapolis market. So they know what areas to definitely avoid that are going to be tough to cash flow. They know a great deal on the buy from something that may appear to be a great deal from a wholesaler that is just looking to, of course, move their product off the book, so to speak. So, that's really the difference, is that it's just knowing and having experience in the market as far as, where do we go to find the best deals. In addition, we have connections with hedge funds where we can go in and buy, large volumes of product at drastically reduced prices because, we're buying in bulk, right? So you're going to get a discount.
Yeah.
Also,
so while we're still,
I was going to say one more thing. I mean, we have a reputation of having quick cash closes. So we're going to get the best pricing. There's really very few people that are going to beat us in being able to acquire things at a discount, just because of the sheer reputation of, hey, when these guys sign the PA, we know they're going to close instantaneously and they're going to close with cash.
Yeah.
Big advantage.
Yeah. And reputation and relationships do matter. So I think it's important here to explain to listeners what the exposure is if you are trying to buy that from yourself. You alluded to one of them, which is the conversation with the wholesaler, or just dealing with a wholesaler that's really just trying to move a property along and, can put some comps in front of the buyer or do some things to make it, oh, great street. The one that always gets me the most, because, obviously I see a lot of wholesalers' sales pitches, is the discussion of ARV, after repaired value. And it is the most nebulous term I have ever seen. Because, I know on streets where, properties are worth maybe $60,000 or $70,000, they're saying the ARV is $85,000 or $90,000. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, in an email, they can say whatever the heck they want. It's a very subjective thing. So, if someone is not careful, they could be deluded into thinking that they're getting a deal when they're not really getting a deal. And I think there's a big danger there.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing that's a big danger in buying from a wholesaler is what we call the wholesaler fluff, right? That the inflated, or well, I should say deflated amount of construction costs that the property is going to take to get it to rent-ready status. Yeah. I mean, think about, Shecky, all those things that we were buying directly from wholesalers, all those properties. I mean, there wasn't one that I can think of where they said, oh, it's going to cost $10,000. And we came in at or under what they said on their, pro forma type. Yeah. Not one time did that happen. We were always over budget, and we were paying people internally. So we weren't having huge contractor markup, so to speak. So I know, I just think that's a tough thing for an out-of-state investor to be able to navigate through what is actually going to, when I buy something, what's it actually going to cost to rehab it? And then of course, the fluff on the rental numbers, they're always much higher than what is actually going to get you a tenant, good quality long-term tenant in a reasonable amount of time. The rent that they propose typically are very high on the market value side, right? So could you get those rent numbers? Sure. If you hold off for 4, 5, 6 months of, vacancy, sure. You can get those rental numbers. You're going to pay for them in the vacancy loss.
Yeah, that's true. And, when you talk about, fluff and rehab, that's a good segue into the next category. So that pretty much covers the buy. So just to recap that portion, you have some exposure if you don't really understand what you're doing and you don't really have the buying relationships in place. Now, it's not to say that you can't get a good deal on the buy long distance. You absolutely can. But we're just wanting to illuminate some of the potential hazards as you go and do that. When you use a turnkey company, obviously they've already got all that stuff dialed in and they're buying based on a system and reputation, and they're pretty much getting the same deals in the same neighborhoods over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say, before I get too much deeper into this conversation, because as you alluded to, we own a turnkey company. So we are certainly going to be skewed towards the bias side of the equation, right?
Sure.
But we want to make sure that you guys understand like our perspective of having essentially all we do is BRRRRs. We're doing the BRRRR process for the investor and mitigating, all of that risk. So whether the question is which one's better, we're not answering that question, because the ultimate answer is it depends. It depends largely on the investor, in my opinion. Like that's whether they should do a BRRRR and try to go after it and save money, or whether they'd be better off buying turnkey. It's going to be highly dependent upon the investor, their situation, their skill sets, their risk tolerance, how much time and energy and effort that they want to put in. So both are very viable options. They're both work and create lots of wealth for, hundreds, thousands of investors. It's just a question of, which direction makes more sense for you.
Yeah, well said. Let's move on to the next category. The first R of BRRRR is rehab. And let's talk about, what it looks like rehabbing a property long distance versus having somebody else like a turnkey company doing that for you, right? So Jack, would you speak to that? What are some of the areas of exposure that an investor might be looking at with those two scenarios?
Well, yeah, we already alluded to the, like when you're buying the property, the danger of the property going well over budget of what you forecast.
Yeah.
So that's certainly one very, very big danger area. The other one is just simply contractors that are taking advantage of you. And it could be taking advantage of you in an unethical way in terms of just simply never completing work that they were paid to do, which you and I have experienced that on a pretty massive level.
Yes.
And or it's just highly inflating the work, like the pricing on the work that they did do. So you're being taken advantage of because you're not boots on the ground to verify, what they're doing. And then the quality of the ending product. I mean, you could be far overpaying for the quality of work that is actually delivered to you. And we've had that happen to us as well, right? The disaster contractor we often refer to.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that should be mentioned that's important in the rehab is time. One of the things that, and again, I want the listeners to understand, because we're doing BRRRRs all the time, and, our company is a little bit more grown up now, you might say, and we have a lot more of our own teams and systems in place than we did before. But as we were coming up the ranks and doing all this, we got burned every possible way that we could get burned. So, we learned from that stuff. And part of the reason for doing an episode like this is to illuminate all those ways that we got burned so that other investors can learn from our mistakes. And within the world of rehab, I think one of the biggest issues that we also had was just time to completion. So, we had properties that, you pay a guy to go out and rehab a property, and maybe it was $10,000 worth of rehab and it needed a bunch of stuff and paint and plumbing and whatever. And then all of a sudden it's like, what's a 2-week job turns into like 4 or 5 months.
Right.
And, the cost of, hold times and, if you're borrowing money to hold that property or, even just if you're not and it's all cash and you're just waiting to start getting your rents, it's just the money is flowing the wrong direction when things go over on the timeline.
Yeah,
So,
Shecky, that's great point. Thinking about how, just for us, how much on certain projects, the holding costs have just, eaten us alive. You're talking, interest rates on money that you're paying. There's insurance costs, there's taxes, there's lawn mowing fees. There's a lot of, when a property is left vacant to the elements, guys, there's more potential for theft. There is more potential for pipes to burst and things to go wrong. And then, like you said, loss of rent too, because your property that's done in 2 weeks is going to start getting much higher likelihood, right, of getting its cash flowing much faster than the property that takes, 4 or 5 months to get done, right?
Yeah.
So, holding costs, huge part of a BRRRR strategy.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next R, while we're still on rehab, I want to add a little piece in there just about validation. Because, one of the things that we learned, granted the hard way, was about how do we validate and make sure that we got a good rehab if we, in our early days, were hiring an outside contractor, or B, now that we're using mostly our own teams, how do we know that our own teams did a good job? And there's really only one good way to do that is with a disinterested third party doing a home inspection and, paying for an inspector to come in and checking out the property. So, even if you have some issues with this long distance BRRRR, you absolutely at the end of the rehab must insist on having a third party inspection. And you must have an agreement with who is ever doing the work that they are responsible for fixing any of the items that come up on inspection that could potentially cause problems to the future worthiness of the property, right? So like in our case, as a turnkey company, we actually call on a third-party inspector and we have them go over everything. Partially, it's because we offer a warranty on the product, but for the most part, it's to show transparency to the investor and for us to make sure that we really did a good job, that the rehab was indeed thorough and everything was addressed with the property and it truly is rent ready and ready to perform in a solid way for many, many years to come. I am amazed at how many investors trying to do a BRRRR long distance don't consider this. And, it's what, $200, $300, $500 for a top of the line one. I mean, it's a tiny amount in comparison to the amount of financial exposure that you have. So this is just a suggestion for anybody listening to make sure that that is included at the end of the rehab process and that any of the outstanding issues, at least the ones that are meaningful towards future performance, are cured and attended to.
Well, yeah, that's a great point. And, investors need to keep in mind the potential danger with their relationship with their contractor, a potential dispute that could easily happen is when you order the inspection, it comes back and then the contractor says, hey, guess what? All this stuff that's on here, or most of it, this wasn't on my original scope of work. So you didn't pay for all this to be done. So now your expectations and are not matching up with the contractor's expectation, which causes a definite rift, stress. Now you got to try to, work something out with them. So that can be a tough situation to consider with the BRRRR strategy. And we've had that happen multiple times.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's now talk about the next R, which is rent. And this is a big one because obviously the next thing, now your property is finished, thankfully, ready to be rented. The big question is, who's going to rent it and who are you going to rent it to? So, Jack, I'm going to let you speak to, because we have some experience with this. If you're doing a BRRRR, then obviously then at that point, let's say you live in San Diego and you're investing in Detroit, whatever, right? You have now got to find a property manager in Detroit or whatever other city in the Midwest you're investing in. What are the pros and cons to doing that, Jack?
Well, the biggest danger with third-party management companies is that you got to think about how are they going to make their money. Okay, so especially in, like, say you're investing into C-class properties where rents are, can be low as, $450 per unit in some cases to, probably on the high end, we see $850. So 10% of that, what is that? $45 to $85 a month to handle and put up with C-class tenants.
Yeah, it's
Guys,
peanuts.
that's a really tough way to make a living, and there's nobody that we've met that's going to make their money on 10% management fees. They're not going to put up with C-class management processes and the tenants for that kind of money. So, okay, so how else are they going to make their money? Well, they're going to make their money on drastically marking up the maintenance and repairs. And that's just the way it is. They got to make their money somehow. So they're going to mark up all your maintenance repairs. They're going to certainly look for maintenance and repairs. And that's where investor cash flow can absolutely get crushed, And Shecky, you wanted to give that specific example of the $5,200 turn.
Yeah, there's
$1,700.
There's two things I want to say. One, before, I'm not trying to create an argument with you, but I would argue that the same is true in B and A class, and I'll tell you why. So even because I know you had mentioned specifically C class, but I know there's listeners out there going, well, okay, if the B class tenant is a little bit easier to manage, and I'm getting, say $1,200 a month rent, then the PM company can do just fine on $120 a month. But I would argue that, again, it's not the case because there is so much markup made on tenant turns, and the B class and A class tenants require a higher level of property condition. I can tell you when I first moved to Indianapolis, I'm probably consider myself a B plus, A minus kind of renter. And I lived in a fancy high rise downtown. And I moved into this thing after somebody else had moved out, and there were some splotches on the paint in my apartment, right? What do you think that management company did for me? They came in and repainted the whole apartment, the whole thing. Now, I know that that's not going to happen because I know we run, for the most part, a C-class turnkey company. If we get a tenant that's saying, hey, I've got a few splotches on the paint, we might address it when we're going through another maintenance call, and we might go and smooth some things out. But there's no way on God's green earth we're going to go repaint that whole house. We're just not going to do it. It just, the amount of rent and the quality of that renter just doesn't warrant it. It doesn't warrant it in C-class. So I don't want the investors to be deluded that property class is going to make all the difference in this particular argument. And another example that I did want to bring up is we had a situation a few months ago, and this was, it's actually almost a year ago now. It was before we had our in-house management, and we were still using some outside property managers who were all excellent, by the way. They did a really, really great job and good communication, everything like that. But we got contacted by one of them saying, hey, one of your investors' properties, the tenant moved out and the property was trashed a little bit, and we've got to go in and take care of it. So we said, okay, great. Let's get an estimate and see what it is. And we got an estimate for like $5,200, $5,300. I mean, it was obscene. And, yes, they had a dog there and they weren't supposed to, and there was some trim that was chewed up and some carpet that needed to be replacing. But we sent our guys in and did the whole thing for $1,700, $1,800. And the property turned out very, very nice for $1,700 or $1,800, and it was pretty trashed. So what I'm saying is that was the day that I started really, really understanding where property managers make their money. And you have to understand, as a BRRRR investor, if you are hiring an outside property management company, unlike the turnkey, they didn't make any money selling you a property. The only profit center they have on you is in the management of your property. there's no question they have to do a good job to maintain your business, but just it's important to understand which side their bread is buttered on. That's all. Mm-hmm. So just, let the buyer beware. That's what this episode is all about. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the next one and talk about the next R, which is refinance. And that one's a little bit tricky one because obviously it's based on appraisal value. So can an investor, buy a property, typically pay cash, or maybe they have some hard money up front to get it done and get the rehab done. But then it comes time to put the long-term leverage in place, and that property needs to appraise for at least a halfway decent amount, right, in order for things to turn out. Now, there's no question when BRRRR is done correctly, and you can buy correctly, and you can rehab correctly, and you can rent correctly, that you can probably slide into a halfway decent appraisal and then get a good refinance. Again, all those other components would have had to have happened perfectly, especially the first one, especially the buy, in order for that to work out well. With a turnkey company, for the most part, they're not going to give you any promises or guarantees that the property is going to appraise, but at the same time, you have some assurance based on the systems that they're never really selling you a property that's over market value. Because if they did, they would be out of business by tomorrow. So because they've got their buy stuff in place, because they've got their rehab stuff in place, because they've got all their rental stuff in place, you can be assured that you're buying into a system and you're somewhat protected from all those other risks. So when refinance time comes around, it's a fairly easy process. Again, no promises, no guarantees, but I think you're reducing that margin of error on what that number could be. Now, Jack, you and I talked about this briefly before we hit the record button. The one place, if you pick up nothing else about this episode, the one thing I really want to get across is that margin for error is super huge when you're doing a BRRRR long distance. You're starting to understand that there's a lot of areas where you have a lot of exposure. So how do you, if you're doing a BRRRR, and again, not discouraging anybody from doing a BRRRR long distance, but if you're doing one, how do you protect yourself within that margin of error? Well, my suggestion would be stay out of C class. Stick to the prettier B class, A class, where you can really scour and look for an amazing deal. Because think about this, if a turnkey company is selling you a property that's B class, and they want to be quote unquote market value, and they're buying right and rehabbing right and doing all those other things, then there's let's say the $110,000 to $140,000 price point within the Midwest, or $100,000 to $140,000. There's a high probability that the approximate markup that this turnkey company is making is somewhere in the $20,000 to $25,000 range per property. I mean, let's just be transparent about what's going on in our industry. To be further transparent, we're in C class. Okay, granted, they're not the Taj Mahal, they're not the prettiest properties, but there's no way that we can put that kind of a markup on our property and still put the investor in a good cash flow position. And I'm not ashamed to admit, Jack, that we make maybe 8 or 10 grand average on a property. Mm-hmm. We have to make it up in volume in order to be able to have a successful company. So what I'm saying is, if you want to do a BRRRR long distance, stay out of C class, because there's not enough margin for error. And even us, with our own acquisition team and our own rehab teams and our own property management teams, right? We still screw up. We still make mistakes. We still have properties that don't rehab for what we thought they were going to rehab for when we bought them. We still run into surprises. Jack, even to this day, yes or no, do we still sell properties and not make any money?
Yes.
I know you're laughing, and I hate to say that we do this, but we do.
If we made the wrong buy and we, went way over budget on the the rehab. We opened up the property and found out there's a, sewage pipe issue that we had to dig for.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that, we won't be able to tell when we buy the property that, can definitely affect our margins, which, as you said, I mean, 8 to 10K is not a lot of margin for errors. So I feel like any investor who does a BRRRR, I feel like we can come really close to, the same type of ending price point as them, because we can save so much money on the acquisition. We can save a lot of money on the internal and economies of scale on our rehabs. And then we can save them a lot of money on the management side, on the actual like cash flowing process after they do, sign and buy the property. So is it to say that investor could come out and beat our pricing? In other words, that's what they're trying to do. If they're trying to do a BRRRR, you're trying to say, okay, I'm going to beat the pricing of the guy who's selling the finished final turnkey product so that I can create more wealth for myself. And in doing that, you have to understand you're becoming an active investor and you're taking on the management oversight and all of the things that go along with that process. And it's a lot of work. So you have to say, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to try to beat the pricing. I'm willing to take the gamble. I'm going to take on all these functions myself. I'm going to, contract and, find the properties and contract people and all this and move and orchestrate this whole thing. And that's what I'm going to do. And so if that's what you want to do, that's great for that investor. They should do BRRRR.
Yeah. And
for the guys who want to be, I don't have the expertise, the time. I don't want to take that risk. I just want to buy the finished goods, cash flowing producing asset, be a mostly hands-off passive investor. Then Turnkey's for them. So, it's not like we said at the beginning, it's not a right or wrong answer.
Yeah, you bring up a good point too. It's interesting. The more we do podcasts and have guests on and become guests on other podcasts, it seems like within the space of real estate investing, almost every answer to every question comes out to it depends.
It depends, yeah.
Right? That's like the most common answer. So
it's just like anything in investing. Is this a great investment? I think almost everything you could say, it depends.
Yeah.
It depends.
That's true.
What's your risk tolerance? How much, as Robert Kiyosaki said, it's not so much the investment, it's the investor.
Yeah. And I think you have to look at it's not just your skill sets, but the amount of time you have to do this kind of stuff. I would say if you want to do a BRRRR long distance, and let's say you wanted to fly into our city from Denver or whatever and do this, if you really want to do it right, it's not going to happen in one visit. Like you're going to have to come to that city and go to the local RIA meetings and, shake hands and develop relationships and ask and find out who the best contractors are and interview people and meet people for lunch and have coffee and go look at projects and, interface with, realtors and, your level of involvement is going to be, let's say, if you're going to achieve the kind of success that you're looking to achieve, your level of involvement is going to have to be extremely high. And that's notwithstanding, by the way, what some of these ebooks or gurus make it out to be like so easy to do a BRRRR from long distance. Because I can tell you, after having been in Indianapolis for a few years and seeing investors that come here to try and do this here, there's a lot of dead bodies out there. And, and obviously the end goal is what's always discussed with a BRRRR is that you can have enough forced equity that when you go to refinance the deal, that refinance is now basically you're financing essentially 100% of what you have into the property. That would be considered the holy grail of a BRRRR, right? So that's the ultimate, or even be able to put a little extra money in your pocket, even better. But so if you came out anywhere in those areas, that's absolutely fantastic. And I do know that there are investors out there that can do this, but just understand these are extremely active investors. These are people that have a lot of relationships, a lot of time involved, understand very thoroughly the markets that they're investing in. This is not necessarily for the faint of heart.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's
Right.
not for the person who has 100 grand and this is my opinion. You know, you got 100 grand and you're going to risk it on trying to do a couple C-class BRRRRs. I mean, you're risking, too big of a percentage of your total investing pie. You
Yeah.
know, guys that have, $1 million cash, 2 million cash, they can definitely take a kind of hit if their BRRRR strategy, that deal doesn't work, or the couple, 3, 4, 5, however many deals they take on, they can withstand that. And who else I don't think it's good for too, Shecky, after, a few years of doing this is, the business owner who, gets totally distracted from the main way that he's really good at making money, or the professional that's got a very strong skill set and knows and has a high earning power and knows how to make a lot of money, right? For them, it's like, stay in your lane and just make more money in the current business, figure out how to optimize your own business, your own profession, make more money in that, because that's what you're good at. Like, stick to that. And then, deploy your resources in a passive way with a great team. Instead of, I think, the danger for that type of investor is that they get so distracted from their main way that they make money that the savings that they then get from doing a BRRRR is actually a loss, because they lost quite a bit of money in their current, profession, in their current business.
Yeah, great point. It's lost opportunity cost from another source of revenue.
Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I don't really have anything else. I think we beat that one up pretty good.
Yeah.
And if you guys or gals, I don't mean to be sexist, but if the listeners out there got some good value out of this conversation, give us a shout out, give us a 5-star review on iTunes, or say nice things about us somewhere out there in the interwebs. And,
I don't feel like we're getting too many 5-star reviews as far as what we deserve for the value of this content that we produce. So I would just like to give a strong call to action to our investors to, I know it takes an extra minute or two, but, throw some love, guys. We're working hard for you on this show.
Yeah, absolutely. And as always, Jack, I love having these conversations with you and appreciate you as a business partner and friend, and your leadership and all the wisdom that you bring to our company and to this industry in general. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Shecky. Everybody, thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.